It's hard to have conversations about race with a therapist who might not be qualified or could understand. Any hints on how we might navigate this? Someone else said they were having a conversation about microaggressions with the therapist, and the therapist told them, this is not a place for you to come here to complain. So also somebody else said that made the point that in communities, marginalized communities, mental health care is not as accessible. So I wanted to ask you a two-part question. One was, how do you find a therapist that can deal with those issues? Like, I understand that on a very deep level, wanting to speak to someone when you're dealing with the realities of what we're seeing. I mean, George Floyd was just one example of the things that people in the Black community would have had to witness for a very long time, since the beginning, actually, and that does affect the psyche. So how do you find a therapist that is that works for you in that way? And then the other thing I wanted to ask you was, do you know of any resources that we can share with people who may not have proper health care or money, and that can have access to some sort of health care? Is there a database? Is there an organization of people who actually donate services or stuff like that?
Absolutely. So I'll answer the latter question first.
Okay.
The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, NAMI.org, is a great site. It's a site that provides education and information about different pathologies and mental health. And it also provides information for different community mental health centers, different community programs, different programs for people who have limits or don't have the funding or the insurance to access care. That's a national type program. They're in almost every big city. Also going on sites like the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychology Association. Most of these national sites will have information on seeking healthcare or mental health care. The other option would be in your town. Go on your hospital's website, call the emergency room and ask to speak to the social worker. Ask the social worker to give you a list of community mental health centers. If you have access to Google, the computer, to a smartphone, a laptop, whatever it is, Google community mental health centers, and Google will search for those places within a certain mile radius of where you live. A lot of major cities and small towns have some sort of community mental health center where someone can seek care. And so I would start with some of those things. And Google is always a good way to try to find information. Now, the cultural sensitivity thing, man. So as bad as COVID was, COVID also exposed a lot of the racism that had been occurring in America for over 400 years. As bad as COVID was, it allowed people to see what's really happening in America, because everyone was home. Everyone was recording things on their smartphones and sharing information. And so we were able to see, and we weren't busy. A lot of people were home from work. They were working from home. And so you had the time to be on social media, to watch the news and see all of these things in the headlines. And so cultural sensitivity has become a major thing now. Everyone has jumped on board with creating a culturally sensitive environment at jobs, on the job, for different companies, including not just hospitals and mental health facilities, but big companies are doing it. Gucci has decided to create a program where they hired someone to manage that. So the activation of our stress response with the pandemic, and then all of the racism that we've seen, has created this system. But it's also shown us who is not as insightful when it comes to race relations and dealing with people. It is also shown that some people who believe they're not racist really have to learn more about culture and the differences between races and nationalities and ethnicities. People are lacking that information. So the way you find a mental health professional who is culturally sensitive is, number one, start with someone who looks like you. If you're a minority, if you're someone of the African diaspora, see someone who's of the African diaspora. If you're someone who's from, let's say, I'm in South Florida. We have a lot of islanders here. We have probably more islanders than we do African Americans, I would think. So we have Haitian mental health providers. We have Jamaican mental health providers. We have folks from South America who are mental health providers. We have African American mental health providers. So start with someone who looks like you, because the assumption you would make is that this person has lived the life of a person who's been silently discriminated against, at least if it wasn't macro aggressions that they've experienced. So depending on that person's background, you take a chance and you make that assumption initially that this person is in the know and they understand it, and that they understand your culture because they were raised in it and that's who they are. When you start with someone who, let's say, is of the majority, they may not be very sensitive to the challenges that we've had in this country. They may be someone who, like you said, Ida, says, oh, slavery was, whatever, 200 years ago, over 200 years ago, 300 years ago, that's been gone. Why are you guys still angry? And there are some therapists who really do talk like that in sessions. And so if that happens, or if they tell you you're complaining, fire them on the spot. I would walk out of the session. I wouldn't even stay and finish the session, because the thing that people forget when they access medical care, whether it's for a physical problem or a mental health problem, is you are the consumer. You're the customer. You're the patient, but you're the customer, you're the consumer. And you should love the service you're receiving. You should like it. And if there is some sort of difference between you and your provider, talk about it. And if you cannot make amends, then just tell them, I'm sorry, you're not a good fit for me, and move on to the next person. And it happens. And sometimes it happens by no fault of the practitioner. Sometimes it's a challenge that the patient is experiencing at the time that causes, to end the patient-doctor relationship. But just tell that provider that I don't think you're a good fit for me, so I'd rather not see you anymore. And sometimes people are not good with that either, because they feel like it's sort of confronting a situation. Just don't schedule any further appointments. And if the provider calls and says, hey, I haven't seen you in a while, I was wondering where you are, you can just say, oh, I'm okay, I decided not to come back. And most providers will accept that and leave it alone.